The massive economic growth and the massive new economic transformations which reshaped the nature of capitalism in the late 19th century in the United States also reshaped the nature of politics and the nature of culture in American society. In fact, we could say that they would create transformations that in many ways are still with us today. Most important, perhaps, of these transformations would be the development of what we can really call distinct social classes in the United States. Now, in the US, of course, everybody believes that they are middle class. Opinion polls that look at the entire US population report that 90% of Americans think of themselves or say that they are middle class. But the reality is that incomes started to diverge rapidly in the 19th century, particularly in the industrializing sectors of the North and the Midwest. People began to live in different places, live in different ways. And they were certainly working in different ways. It was impossible for this not to also create deep divisions in the way they thought and the way that they thought about themselves. In fact, we can see this persistent desire on the part of Americans to say that they are middle class as an attempt to deny the reality that really became very obvious in the late 19th century. So part of the myth that says that all Americans are middle class, one of the really deep assumptions that's part of that myth is the idea that in the United States, everybody can go from the bottom to the top in the course of a lifetime. And it's certainly the case that we can find lots of examples throughout US history of cases in which that really does happen. But it's also true that in the late 19th century, what you began to see is that increasingly the people who are running the corporations, running the factories, making the biggest profits on the stock and commodity markets, increasingly were the children of people who had done the same thing. It becomes more and more rare to see somebody start at the bottom and move to the top. It's still happening, but it's happening less in the late 19th century. And one effect of that, and it's also an effect of the large-scale immigration into the US at this time, one effect of this is that increasingly the wealthy began to move apart from the not-so-wealthy. And they do this in several ways. One of them is literal movement from here to there. Spatially, US cities began to be arranged in very different ways as wealthy people increasingly live farther away from poor people. Now you can look at New York City, let's say, in the 1820s, and you can say, all right, over here we see a wealthy neighborhood, and over here we see a neighborhood like the Bowery or Five Points. These areas where the poor immigrants tend to cluster. But those areas are within a few minutes walk from each other. With the new technologies, in particular the streetcar, what you start to see is the early suburbanization of wealthy neighborhoods. People literally are living farther away from the poor. They also start to separate themselves in other ways as well. They create new kinds of institutions, and they also transform old institutions to keep the less wealthy out. For instance, in the pre-Civil War United States, the militia was an institution where all male citizens were supposed to train regularly. In reality, they didn't train very often, but to train regularly in order to defend the country against attacks. Maybe the British would come back. Maybe Native Americans would attack a frontier settlement. But most states had militia laws that compelled all citizens, all male citizens, to participate in training. After the Civil War, militia institutions or militia units, which start to become known as National Guard, change. They become class segregated. Increasingly, wealthy people are forming their own units, building their own armories, which are heavily fortified to protect against labor unrest, and they start to see their mission as twofold. One, to put down strikes, and two, to hang out with other young men of the same sort of social class and rank, drink nice brandy, smoke fine cigars, and things like that. The division also happens at the level of ideas as well. Now, there was certainly no lack in the American past and in the human past in general of arguments that say, for instance, those of high rank are simply inherently better than those of low rank. But in the history of the U.S., particularly since independence, aside from ideas of racial inequality, especially those focused at justifying the inequality of Native Americans and African Americans, aside from that, what you'd seen over the course of the 1800s had been a movement towards more democratic ideas. Even if wealthy people thought that they were better than poor people, they increasingly couldn't say that in public. We see this in particular with the political reforms of the 1820s and 1830s that make politics simply more democratic, more Jacksonian, if you will. After 1865, and particularly late in the 19th century, increasingly wealthy people are starting to say that there's something inherently better about them. They're justifying their own success. Now, some people call this philosophy the idea of social Darwinism. And in fact, you start to see some thinkers applying Darwin's ideas about evolution and the survival of the fittest to social relationships and to economic success, and arguing that the tremendous shift in wealth that you see that makes the wealthier much wealthier over the late 19th century is simply justified by their greater fitness, their greater intelligence, a sort of greater inherent work ethic, things like that. So this shift in ideas is a really significant one in that it moves the American tradition in a different direction, from an increased democratization to an actual movement away from democratization. Now, parallel to this increasing coherence, if you will, in the upper classes, in terms of what they thought about less wealthy people, was an actual shift in the political parties. Before the 1870s and 1880s, the political parties really had stood for different policy programs. So in the 1830s and 40s, what the Whigs and the Democrats want to do with the federal government, with infrastructure investments, with the expansion of slavery, these are really different. They want to do different things. But from the 1870s onward, it becomes very difficult to tell the top layer of the Democrats and the top layer of the Republicans apart, not just in terms of who they are, but in terms of what they want to do as policy. Both parties' leaderships support the gold standard, so both of them support this shift into a more deflationary policy. Both parties oppose the substantial regulation of the economy to break apart these increasingly large, well-integrated corporations. Both parties oppose large-scale unionization. And both parties oppose any substantial intervention on the part of the federal government to change the balance of power in the South, to return more rights to the hands of recently enslaved African Americans who have lost much of their power with the collapse of Reconstruction in the 1870s. So the parties substantially agree, and they substantially cohere around their common identity, the common identity of their leaders as members of the new American upper class.